Have you ever noticed, how does silence make people uneasy? A woman stops reaching, stops being seen, stops saying yes when her soul screams no, and the world assumes something is wrong. They whisper, she's broken, she's lost, she must be missing something. But what if the opposite is true? What if silence is the beginning of awakening? What if the absence of desire isn't failure but freedom? We live in a world that worships noise, constant movement, endless connection, proof of being wanted. A body in stillness threatens that rhythm. A woman who doesn't crave to be seen becomes unreadable, uncontrollable. But beneath that still surface, something ancient stirs. The body withdraws not from life but from illusion. And in that quiet space, the soul speaks. Softly at first, then louder, then unmistakable. This is not emptiness. This is our entry. This is not loneliness. It is the first light of return. You see, abstinence isn't always a choice of denial. Sometimes it's a sacred rebellion, a calling home. Carl Jung called it individuation, the slow, holy unraveling of everything false, so the true self can be born. And it begins in the silence. So if you've ever felt it, that strange ache when the world feels too loud, too shallow, too scripted, if you've felt the need to step away, not because you are weak, but because you are listening, then you are not breaking down. You are waking up. And the journey back to yourself is about to begin. There comes a moment when the body no longer reaches, not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but out of a deep, unspoken knowing. The touch she once craved no longer satisfies. The attention she once lived for now feels like noise. And the old hunger to be wanted, to be desired, begins to dissolve. This is not numbness. This is clarity. The body quiets, and in that quiet, something sacred begins to stir. Not because she's given up, but because she's tuning in. Desire doesn't disappear, it is refined. It stops looking outward and begins to flow inward. Not seeking another, but seeking alignment. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the slow return to wholeness, the unraveling of borrowed identities. When a woman stops performing for affection, her soul finally has room to speak. You see, the body carries more than flesh. It holds memories, emotion, archetype, repression. And when it stops responding to the old patterns, to the same games, the same roles, the same emotional rehearsals, it's not breaking down. It's breaking through. The silence of the body isn't absent. It's presence, not emptiness, but spaciousness. A sacred pause that makes room for something ancient to rise. The feminine energy, long buried beneath expectation and performance, begins to breathe again. She is not hiding, she is gestating, and like any deep transformation, it begins in the dark, slowly, quietly, invisibly. But from that darkness, something luminous prepares to emerge. Because once the body silences the noise of survival, the soul begins to remember what it came here to become. And this remembering leads us to the next threshold, where silence gives way to vision, and abstinence begins to alchemize into awakening. When the body withdraws, the soul doesn't vanish, it deepens. In the absence of touch, a different kind of sensitivity begins to emerge, one not rooted in reaction, but in recognition. Dreams sharpen. Intuition returns like an old friend. Emotions no longer arrive as chaos, they come as messengers, each one carrying the truth of a need once ignored. This is not repression, it's refined. Abstinence, so often mistaken for emptiness, is not the denial of life. It's the redirection of energy, from the surface to the source. What once rushed outward to be seen begins to spiral inward, seeking understanding. She stops reaching for others to reflect her worth, and begins to witness her own radiance not through a lover's gaze, but through the mirror of her soul. This inward turn is not a retreat, it's a return to herself, to the one beneath the roles, beneath the conditioning, beneath the ache to belong. And this shift, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, begins to rewrite everything. The longing that once begged for affection becomes presence. The cravings that once disguised themselves as love reveal themselves as echoes of abandonment. Now, in this stillness, she hears what could never be heard in the noise of needing. Carl Jung spoke of this as the moment the unconscious begins to speak consciously, where every repressed instinct, every forgotten feeling, every piece of soul she gave away to be enough, comes back home, not to overwhelm her, but to complete her. She is no longer the muse, no longer the prize to be chosen. She becomes the chooser, the container, the source. This is not just abstinence from the body, it is abstinence from illusion. And what unfolds is not deprivation, but discernment. A power, once scattered through desire, begins to gather quietly inside her. And the more she honors this silence, the more she senses she was never missing anything. She was just misdirected, because everything she was searching for was never outside of her. But the silence doesn't only awaken beauty, it also reveals what she had long hidden from herself. As the outer noise fades, the inner voices grow louder, the doubt, the ache, the unfinished memories. This is not a flaw in the process, it is the process. Carl Jung would call this the meeting with the shadow, the parts of ourselves we disowned, disguised, or dismissed just to survive. The woman who once performed to be desired now faces the quiet truth of who she was beneath that performance. The politeness that masked her rage, the caregiving that disguised her loneliness, the sensuality that sometimes substituted for self-worth. And now, without the mirrors of others, without the distraction of being wanted, she begins to see not just the pain she felt, but the pain she carried for others. Not just the roles she played, but the parts of herself she had to silence in order to play them. The journey into abstinence, into silence, does not protect her from the dark. It leads her into it because only there, in the quiet cave of the self, can the buried be reclaimed. This is not regression, it's reconciliation. And Jung, with his lifelong devotion to the psyche's depth, described it as individuation, a sacred, often painful integration of all that had been fractured, not the pursuit of perfection, but the return to wholeness. She begins to understand her discomfort is not dangerous, it's data. Her restlessness isn't wrongness, it's revelation. Each ache, each doubt, each flash of memory is a map back to herself. And though the path is not linear and the healing not immediate, she now walks with intention, not outward, toward approval, but inward, toward truth. and the deeper she goes, the clearer it becomes. This silence was never about absence. It was an invitation, a threshold. The outer world may no longer recognize her, but for the first time, she recognizes herself. But insight does not come without resistance. Once she begins to see herself clearly, the world around her grows restless, not because she is doing harm, but because she is no longer playing along. Friends start to ask, "Are you okay?" Family gently suggests she should get back out there. Old lovers reappear, wearing familiar smiles and unfamiliar intentions. And beneath it all, temptation whispers. Return to the known. Return to the rhythm of being wanted. Return to the roles even if they never truly fit. Because this silence, this beautiful, terrifying stillness is not easy to carry. There are days it feels like isolation. Nights it echoes like absence. Moments it feels like she is fading, unseen, unchosen, untouched. And she begins to wonder, have I gone too far inward? Am I wasting time? Have I made myself invisible? But Jung would say this is not invisibility. This is the veil before rebirth. When the ego no longer calls the shots, it panics. It wants to return to what felt safe, even if it was slowly eroding her. This is the encounter with the shadow, the reckoning with every part of herself that once stayed quiet to survive. The version of her that smiled through silence, that gave without receiving, that seduced me to feel seen. Now, in the absence of performance, those parts rise to the surface, not to shame her, but to be integrated, to be healed. And the pain that arrives, it's not regression, it's release. Because every transformation carries its ache. Even a butterfly must break the boundaries of its own cocoon. The tightness she feels, the discomfort, the longing, the spiritual fatigue isn't failure, it's labor. The soul preparing to emerge, reshaped, redefined, reborn. And yes, the world will resist, because the woman who no longer needs to be chosen cannot be controlled. She's no longer the echo of others' desires. She becomes the origin of her own. And that is when the real metamorphosis begins. And then quietly, without fanfare, something shifts. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or certainty. It arrives like a soft breath, like the first warmth of sunlight after a long night. She no longer craves to be seen. She begins to see, not through the lens of longing, but with the clarity of someone who no longer needs to perform. She is no longer pacing at the doorway of love, hoping to be invited in. She becomes the house, the fire, the sanctuary. Her presence, once scattered by the need to please, becomes whole. And in that wholeness, a strange radiance rises, not loud, not showy, but undeniable. She no longer loves to escape her loneliness. She loves from overflow, not to fill a void, but to reflect her fullness. The silence, once feared, becomes a sacred dialect. The absence, once mourned, becomes an altar. Now, she walks into rooms not needing to be chosen because she has already chosen herself. The world, used to women bending, doesn't quite know how to hold her anymore. She no longer apologizes for her boundaries, no longer shrinks for comfort, no longer softens truths to make others stay. She becomes still, and in that stillness, powerful. This is the fruit of the darkness she endured. What once felt like invisibility becomes sovereignty. What once felt like silence becomes a song. What once felt like emptiness becomes space for the soul to move freely, unburdened by old scripts. And here, in this new rhythm, she understands something deeper. She was never too much. She was simply too sacred for spaces built on half-truths. Her transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who she was before the world told her who to be. And now, something deeper awakens. Not just within her, but around her. Because a woman who has crossed through silence does not return the same. She carries the imprint of transformation not as a badge, but as a frequency. Without trying, she becomes a mirror. A quiet mirror that reflects the truth others are afraid to see in themselves. She does not need to teach. Her presence speaks. She does not need to lead. Her stillness guides. She becomes the torch not to light the way for others, but to remind them they, too, carry a fire. The darkness she once feared is now her companion. She walks it without flinching, because she has learned that the soul does not bloom in comfort. It blooms in courage. Her silence, now louder than applause. Her presence, now heavier than performance. And she is no longer seeking. She is summoning. Not lovers, not followers, not admirers, but equals. Those who come must come whole, or be ready to become whole. Because the version of her that once tolerated half-truths, half-love, half-living, no longer exists. She doesn't crave connection to be filled. She chooses a connection that resonates with what's already full within her. And in this new rhythm, a calling forms. Not a career, not a title, a deeper mission, to hold space for others as they fall apart, to whisper when someone else forgets how to hear, to sit with the silence of another without rushing to fill it, not to save anyone, but to stand unwavering as proof that wholeness is not given. It is remembered that love is not something we chase, it is something we become. And now, her life is no longer about being chosen. It is about choosing from soul, from truth, from the sacred. When the body falls silent, the soul does not vanish. It begins to rise, not with noise but with knowing, not to be seen but to see. She no longer walks to be saved. She walks to save space for truth, for stillness, for those brave enough to stop running. What once felt like absence now reveals itself as sacred preparation. What once felt like loss was the clearing before emergence. And if you felt it, that quiet ache, that shift inside, that strange dissonance with the world you used to fit, then maybe this isn't random. Maybe it's not confusion. Maybe it's a call. Because the soul does not shout, it whispers. And when the body finally quiets, that whisper becomes a voice. So if something in you has begun to stir, if silence feels more honest than noise, if love now begins with you, then perhaps your soul has already begun to speak. And it's not the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of everything is real. If something in you stirred while watching, don't turn away. This isn't just a video. It's a mirror. And if the reflection feels unfamiliar, it means you're closer than you think. Subscribe to Echoes of Thought, not for answers, but for the voice you've been quieting inside yourself. Share your story below. Someone else may need your truth to remember their own. Send this to the woman who's gone quiet. She may not be lost. She may be waking up. The journey inward isn't loud.